So we'll go through this particular sheet, going through and working on solving some of these equations with taking the square root. So kind of work our way into it here. The first one, it's pretty straightforward. It's n squared equals 81. Again, the whole objective here is to get n by itself, so we have to undo the square root. So we know at this point, so for n squared equals 81, we need to take the square root of both sides. So this is with n, and then remember, whenever you take the square root, you have plus or minus, and 81 is one that we know. Here we have r squared, so we need to take the square root of that. And you take the square root of negative 47. Well, r squared will turn into just r. We have plus or minus, and 47 doesn't factor down, but we can deal with a negative. We pull out an I, and then we leave the 47 underneath the square root. All right, for number 3, it's a little bit, one extra step we got to do. All right, we got to isolate the squared part, so we need to add 2 to both sides. And we're left with x squared equals 4. And now we need to take the square root of both sides. Remember, when we take the square root of x squared, it turns into x. And when we take the square root of 4, we know that, but don't forget the plus or minus in front of the 2. Here, divide both sides by negative 10 to isolate the m squared. So m squared equals negative 9. Now we need to take the square root of m squared, which means we need to take the square root of negative 9. M squared will turn into m, and here we know the square root of 9 is 3. And then we also have the I, and don't forget the plus or minus out front. So here we subtract 8 from both sides, so we're left with x squared equals negative 17. Now we need to take the square root of both sides, so the square root of negative 17. Square root of x squared is x, and the square root of negative 17, well, 17 is not going to go anywhere, but we can pull an I out front. Don't forget the plus or minus out in front of it all. Here, we got to divide by 2 on both sides, so r squared equals negative 90. Now it's time to take the square root of r squared, and so we also take the square root of negative 90. That'll turn into r. Now we just need to kind of break this down. This will be, let's see, 30 times 3. We have 10 times 3, so we can pull out a 3. So let me actually move my r down a little bit. And with r equals plus or minus, you got the 3 that you can pull out. You also have to deal with a negative that's sitting right here underneath the square root. So we have an I, and a 10 is left underneath the radical symbol. On the back page, now we got a few more steps involved, but just one step at a time. 6n squared equals negative 108 when we subtract 5. Divide both sides by 6, so we end up with 108 divided by 6 is 18. So now we have n squared equals negative 18. And go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And 18 will turn into 9 and 2, so we have 3 and 3. So at the end of the day, we end up with n equals plus or minus. We can pull out the 3. There's a negative under the square root, so we have I, and then there's a 2 left underneath. Here, let's add 2 to both sides. So 4m squared equals 80. Divide both sides by 4, and 80 divided by 4 is 20. So m squared equals 20. Now let's go ahead and take the square root of both sides. 20 is not a perfect square, but we do know that's 4 times 5, so we have 2 and 2 that can be pulled out. So we end up with m equals 2 square root of 5, and the one thing we got to make sure we squeeze in there, I didn't leave myself much room, the plus or minus. Always remember the plus or minus. Next problem. So here, we got to move this 4 over. That's a positive 4. This is a little bit tricky because of the negative that's sitting right here, but that negative is actually with the 10. So let's move the 4 over. It's a positive 4, so subtract 4 from both sides. So we're left with negative 10p squared equals negative 870. Divide both sides by negative 10. So we end up with p squared equals 87. And now we can take the square root of both sides. And 87 actually doesn't do anything. Now at this point we just need to make sure we put that plus or minus in front of 87. Here, let's add 1 to both sides. So we end up with 3p squared equals 267. And then 267, take a second, divide that by 3. Divide both sides by 3. We end up with 89. Now we can take the square root of both sides. And again, 89 is not going to do anything for you, so we end up with plus or minus square root 89. Here we have to, again, get the squared part by itself. So to do that, we need to get rid of this negative 3. In order to get rid of that negative 3, that's actually being multiplied by the whole thing. So let's divide by negative 3 and divide by negative 3. So we're left with x minus 4 squared equals negative 9. Now, to undo the squaring, we need to take the square root. So that'll leave us with x minus 4 on one side, and then this turns into plus or minus 3i. X still isn't quite all by itself because we need to add 4 to both sides. We cannot add 4 to 3i, so what we have is 3 plus 4, or 4 plus 3i, or 4 minus 3i. Again, you could also write this as x equals 4. You could just do the plus or minus in one step. These are saying the exact same thing. And finally, number 12, here's another one of these. We have to divide by 5 at the beginning. So 120 divided by 5 is 24. So we have x minus 3 quantity squared equals 24. And it's at this point we need to undo the squaring. We can't do anything with 3 because it's inside the parentheses right now. So we're left with x minus 3 on one side, plus or minus square root of 24. We need to add the 3 to both sides. So x equals 3 plus or minus root 24. 24 doesn't seem like it's quite simplified enough, so let's see if we can break it down. And sure enough, there's 4 and 6. So we have a 2, a 2, a 2, and a 3, so we can pull out 1, 2. So really here, x equals 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root. I don't know why I wrote that. 3 is an 8. But we can pull out the 2, and we're left with a 6 underneath. So there's your final answer for number 12.